Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I'm sure we'll have quite a few other people popping in the next few minutes, but we might as well go ahead and get started. So this is our live event on course mapping, and Dawn and Katie are going to share with us the process and the reasoning behind it, all of that wonderful stuff. So I will let them take it away.
Hi, everyone. I'm Don Saucier. I'm a professor of psychological sciences, and I'm also the associate director of the Teaching and Learning Center. And I'm very excited to be part of this virtual event this morning on course mapping. And I'll let my co-presenter Katie introduce herself.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Katie Linder, the Executive Director for Program Development for Global Campus, and I have a particular passion for course and curriculum design, so I'm also really excited to be presenting this information to you today and really looking forward to your questions.
So we're gonna start out by talking about course mapping, obviously. But one of the things that I want to point out that's kind of extra special for me is that I'm being challenged in a new way. And until our transition to remote teaching, I had only taught face-to-face classes. And now what we're doing is we're having to think about teaching in a different domain, but we're applying all of the things that made us effective in other domains to this one. So it's a new challenge for me to kind of take the things that I've done face to face and to articulate them for a remote teaching model that we're working on now. So this is challenging. There's going to be some things that we don't get right the first time, but we can do this. And I'm really excited to be able to do this with all of you in this event today and moving forward. So to start out, we're going to talk about a little bit what course mapping is. We're going to offer up a kind of a general definition. So our general definition here, right, for course mapping is a guided tour for your course that you can follow through over the course of the semester. And right away, what you're kind of seeing the language that we're picking is it's exciting, right? It's a guided tour. And one of the things that we can always do is we can get excited about our teaching and we can use that excitement to help our students learn. So this isn't a boring kind of thing. This isn't kind of an exercise that we just go through. This is not busy work. This is something that actually articulates in really cool ways what our course is going to do. And the way that I think about it is as a puzzle. When I come into class for the first time and I'm thinking about where does everything fit and how am I going to get it all in and how am I going to make sure that I'm assessing the learning in appropriate ways so that my students can demonstrate their learning to me and then I can understand where their confusions are and answer their questions. That's daunting at first. But I use it as a challenge and I use it as a puzzle and I like puzzles. And what it produces is a plan. Or even the way I think about it, it produces a to-do list. I love to-do lists. I love knowing what's coming up next. I love knowing what I've got to do. I love knowing where I'm going to focus my time. I love knowing where my students are going to focus their time. So I think about course mapping as this puzzle that you have, the challenge, that intellectual challenge to create that's going to produce a to-do list for you and for your students that's going to create a plan for your entire semester. This, I think, is a really, really exciting intellectual challenge that becomes a practical guiding document.
All right, so we also wanted to talk about some of the benefits of course mapping. I'm curious though for folks here, how many of you have done some kind of course mapping where you're kind of looking ahead over the term? Go ahead and drop into the chat if this is something that you feel relatively familiar with, it's something that you've tried in the past, or let us know if you're like, nope, this is new. Haven't really thought about, planning from this perspective yet. All right, so for at least one person, this is new. What about other folks? Is this something you feel like you have some experience with? New for some other folks too? Okay. Some folks have tried it before. All right. So I think it's even more helpful when it's new to people to think about why would we do this in the first place? Why would we take the time to do this kind of course mapping? So this is why we wanted to talk a little bit about the benefits. So one of the benefits is around coverage. When you can look at a course over the course of an entire term, you get a sense of where are all the learning objectives for the course fitting in, depending on the week that they're being presented. Do you have a nice mix of different strategies that would kind of help students learn in a range of different ways? And also because you learned in the first week of the Course Design Institute, we talked a lot about aligning course learning objectives with other parts of things like activities or assignments that you might be creating. You can also use a course map to see if everything is being assessed at a certain point over the course of the term. So it's kind of a little bit of like a check and balance for your course, that you can kind of make sure that the coverage is happening in a way that makes sense to you, and that, you know, things are kind of getting plugged in a particular way. The second benefit really comes to constructive alignment. And this is something that we know from the literature around course design is something that helps students learn. When they can see the connection between the course learning objectives and how they're being assessed, and they know that assignments aren't busy work, they can see a direct connection between the things that they're being asked to do and the things that they have been showing evidence of their learning for in the course. So constructive alignment allows you to kind of really draw those connections in very concrete ways for your students. And it makes it easier for you to embed that kind of information into things like your assignment structure and into the descriptions that you're giving to students about what they're being asked to do. Now, there's a couple other benefits to course mapping as well. One of them is you get to focus a little bit more on sequencing and thinking about the order in which you're presenting your content, and maybe even thinking about new ways that you might want to order your content so that you can present it in maybe different ways than you have in the past. Or maybe you have certain kinds of ordering structures that you use within your discipline, but you want to try something new, or you notice that students always have kind of a struggle with a particular concept, so you want to introduce it earlier than you normally would. You can also think about the concept of scaffolding, which is basically how are you building up to certain concepts that might be more difficult for students to understand, or are there certain building blocks within your course that things need to happen before other things? You know, you don't want to give some information too soon because it might be confusing for students. So scaffolding allows you to kind of do a little bit of a building block throughout the course to make sure that students are getting the right information in the right order and sequence. Now, the last thing I think that's really important about a course map is that it offers you a kind of support system. So right now, what we're seeing in our course designs is we're having to be a little bit flexible, maybe a lot flexible in what's happening during the course of the term. And a course map is something that can be shifted and changed. It's not set in stone. But if you have it in front of you, you can kind of make it a little bit modular and think about, okay, well, what can I switch in the latter part of the quarter or the latter part of the term if something has happened where I really need to kind of mix things up or look at the course in a different way. And what happened this spring is a perfect example of this. We all had to kind of rethink what our courses would look like as we shifted them online. So you can always refer back to your course map throughout the time that the course is being offered. And it may also help you to feel a little bit more comfortable and more ready as the course is beginning, that you kind of have it laid out. You have a sense of what things are going to look like, and you're not doing as much kind of week to week planning because you have a sense throughout the course map of the order in which things are going to take place. Now, I think many of us use our syllabus for something like this. We have a sense of the schedule, but we don't necessarily know the activities, or we don't necessarily know the learning objectives that are happening in every week. So you can think about this in some ways as a more detailed, in-depth view of what you would put in the schedule for your course in the syllabus. And you're not necessarily sharing it with students because it's more in-depth. It's more for you to kind of have that pathway. But I think it can create a level of confidence if you're doing a course that feels like a new prep. And for those of us who are doing online teaching for the first time or who are newer to online teaching, even if you've taught a course a lot in the past in terms of the content, it can still feel like a new prep because of the different tools and technologies that you might be engaging. So having a course map is a way of kind of figuring out some of the things that you want to play around with from the very beginning. It gives you that sense of confidence that you know where everything is going to fit and that it all does fit into the term in the way that you're hoping it will. And it also gives you something that you can follow throughout the term and use as a way to replan or kind of pivot if you end up needing to do that at any given point. So those are some of the benefits that you can expect to have from working through a course map.
Now, I'll say that I personally, I need those benefits. I need to have that psychological safety and that psychological support that this plan creates. Being a psychologist, I can tell you that the two best ways to reduce stress are to increase prediction and increase control. And course maps allow us to increase the prediction and the control of our courses. However, it doesn't mean it's going to be easy to do those things. So, for instance, one of the things that's really hard, at least for me in creating my course maps, is thinking about how things do interconnect into that puzzle. So, thinking about how my information is going to transition from topic to topic. I had seen a wonderful talk recently on critical thinking, and they said that one of the things that we can do to inspire students' critical thinking is by showing them connections. So, it shouldn't be that course topics are just randomly ordered. And it might be hard to think about that logical progression, that logical transition from topic to topic to topic. Well, I would much rather do that before I'm teaching the course than I'm mid-stride into the course and trying to think about how to make that connection. So for me, I really like the idea of trying to think about where those connections and transitions are. But in a course like general psychology, and that'll be the example that we show you of a little bit with my course mapping, those topics don't necessarily all transition to each other smoothly. So kind of thinking about where things fit, what information they need early, what information they can save for later, that's going to be important. And one of the things that I recommend in this is I try to start the semester really, really strong with a solid foundation. And I try to end the semester really strong with some really cool applications of what we had learned early. So there's a flow to my class where they're not doing kind of the heaviest, hardest lifting at the end. They're doing things where they feel better about applying their information at the end that we've scaffolded that entire semester. So the end is kind of a celebration of their learning rather than kind of the hardest part. So these are kind of things that I think about in helping this challenge of transition. The second challenge that we'd like to articulate is kind of making decisions without knowing what your students will need. It is really hard to come up with a semester-long plan without knowing really how long it's going to take you to teach information and how long it's going to take your students to master that information or show some level of mastery of that information. So one of the things that I'm not great at, I wasn't great at this in my face-to-face classes, and I'm probably not going to be great at this in my remote to remote teaching either, is knowing how much time to spend in each topic. So Katie had mentioned flexibility earlier, and I'm going to say that understanding that there's going to have to be some flexibility and some alteration is probably going to be important. But it doesn't mean I'm not going to start out with my best effort at what I think that plan is going to be. It just means that being a teacher who cares about my students' learning and wanting to promote their success, I'm going to keep track of that to make sure that I'm doing what I need to do to satisfy my student learning outcomes by having my students actually learn the content I'm trying to teach them. And what that means is that nothing is set in stone and that plans may need to change. And this is one of the reasons that we might want to keep that course map, kind of to ourselves. We let that syllabus be out there. We let that module set up or that page set up, however we've kind of set up that course, we let that out there. But we don't necessarily tell our students exactly what activities we're going to be doing. One of the things that I often find is that the way that I do an assignment the first time isn't the way that I would do it the second time. So I might have to have some revisions to my course plan as I go through. So I try to use my course map as my initial plan, but I keep heavy notes on this for myself for revisions that need to take place. And it is really hard. This last challenge that we have on our slide here is to make choices about what to do when you're planning for weeks where you don't even know how to teach yet. Again, maybe this is a little bit too much personal sharing, but sometimes when I'm teaching a course for the first time and I put a topic for week 13, I really don't understand what that topic entails in week 13. I'm going to learn that information between week 1 and week 13. So what happens is I might not have a wonderful course map for that because I didn't really embrace the coolness of that topic or the nuance of that topic or understand the connections to the other topics that I've taught. So a course map is a plan, but is a revisable plan. And I think we have to be a little bit comfortable with that and know that when we're getting into it.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about the elements of a course map and the kinds of things that you would be including. So the course map that we've offered you in the Online Course Design Institute first starts with just the week. What is the week that you're looking at? And is there a particular topic for that week? Now, some people, when they get deep into course design and the way that we've been talking about it in the Online Course Design Institute, will say, well, wait, what's the topic? Because I'm so used to thinking about the learning objectives. This has been the real emphasis that we've been putting into the course design. So topic might be, something that the readings are focused around or a theme or something like that that week is focused on. The objectives are your learning objectives that you think are going to be covered in that particular week. Now, this is something that we don't often include in our course schedules. I don't see this very frequently in syllabi where we would really break out the learning objective by the week. But the idea here, again, is to make sure you have that coverage, that you're putting in the learning objective within a particular week so that you know it's going to be talked about or discussed or assessed within a particular week of the course. Now, there's also a couple of boxes each week for what we're calling direct instruction and guided inquiry. And these are two different kinds of kind of pedagogical structures for how you might be thinking about engaging students in the course. So direct instruction is going to include activities in your course that are more led by you. So this might be things like lecture videos or demonstrations that you're giving to students, or activities where students are really following your lead about what it is that they're supposed to be doing. And this could also include if you're providing videos of other people, or you bring in like an expert panel on Zoom or something like that. All of that would be considered direct instruction. Guided inquiry is when you're putting activities into the course space where students are taking more of the lead on their learning. So things like small group activities, or if you have like a student-led research project where they get to do some choice about what it is that they're looking for, things like digital scavenger hunts, all of those things would be more guided inquiry activities. Reading could definitely, I see this comment coming into the chat, reading could definitely be a form of guided inquiry if you had maybe, direct instruction might be if you have students with some guiding questions that you want them to answer and you're kind of telling them to look for specific things in the reading. But if they're applying particular things from the course to the reading and they have like a discussion board post or something like that that they need to be responding to, that could definitely be considered more student-led in terms of them thinking about how this is directly connecting to the things they're learning in the course. Now, we also have social presence, and this is something that we're going to be talking a little bit more about next week in the Online Course Design Institute. But social presence is when you're intentionally choosing different ways to have students connect with you, to have students connect with each other. So if you have like an icebreaker built into the first week of your course where they're introducing themselves to each other in the discussion board, this would be a good example of social presence. So different ways that people are kind of interacting with each other within the course. And this is something that we want to be a little bit more intentional about with online, because as we know in the face-to-face classroom, some of the social presence happens by default. Students will show up to the class early, they'll talk about what they did over the weekend, they might walk out together, talk in the hallway. We don't necessarily have those opportunities in the online classroom. We can create kind of water cooler discussion boards and things like that, but we really have to seed the social presence and make sure that those opportunities are there for our students. You also, of course, have a box each week for assessment and or evaluation. So if you're doing a kind of summative check-in with students to see kind of how things are going or to gather some feedback, you might also have more formal assessments that are happening in the course around an assignment or an exam. And you'll want to make sure that you're checking that and making sure that that's included there as well. And then also you may have metacognition or reflection. And these are opportunities throughout your course where you're asking students to reflect on their own learning. So if you ever ask students with their like engaging in your online course for the first time, you might say, what's challenging about engaging in this online course? Or what do you like? What's working well for you about engaging in this online course? What's helping you learn? What's hindering your learning? Anything that's helping them to think about their own learning and their own process would be considered that metacognition and reflection. Journaling is a great way to help students to engage in this level of reflection, and there's a tool within Canvas that can help you to do that. We're modeling that within the Online Course Design Institute, so you can get a sense of what that looks like from the student perspective. But these are different opportunities that you would want to be including there. So when you're thinking about the course map elements, there's a couple other considerations to think about as well. And this is on the next slide, Laura. One of those considerations is you're going to have certain things within these course map elements that are asynchronous or synchronous. And that can be applied to each box. So for example, you might have a direct instruction that could be asynchronous, or you could have a direct instruction that could be synchronous. You could have a reflection that's asynchronous or one that's synchronous. And so you might want to note that for each week if you're trying to do something more asynchronously or more synchronously, so you can see the mix and match of how often you're doing each one of those things. Now, the other thing to think about with a course map, And this can be kind of hard, especially if you're like a type A personality that you want to fill in all the boxes. The goal is not really to fill in all the boxes. It's to make sure that you have a mix and match of different things happening throughout the entire term. So we're not looking necessarily to make sure everything across the entire row is filled in every week, but we are wanting to make sure that you're checking off those boxes at least some points throughout the term. So for example, with social presence, it may not necessarily be showing up every single week, but maybe every other week you're making an effort to have students really interact with each other in a meaningful way, or you're trying to touch base with them in a meaningful way. Now, some people would feel, well, I really want social presence every week. I want to make sure that that's included. You can do that too. But for things like assessment and evaluation, it may not be that you have something due every single week for them, or maybe it is that you have something due. There's a lot of flexibility there in terms of what those boxes look like. So I want to make sure that that's emphasized, that you don't have to fill in every single box for every single row. So before we dive into some examples, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions as well, we wanted to offer you some guided questions of how to engage with the course map. And these are also included in the discussion kind of description in the Online Course Design Institute. When we have the course map assignment and examples in there, you're also going to see some of these guiding questions. The first one is, should your learning objectives be scaffolded? In other words, does some need to come before others? And we mentioned this earlier as a benefit of thinking about kind of the order in which you're presenting information to students and kind of asking them to provide evidence of their learning. And it may be that certain things need to happen before other things. You can also ask yourself what kind of assignment, activity, or assessment could work best to help students accomplish a particular learning objective. And it may be that that allows you to figure out where that would go in your course map based on when it is that you're covering that learning objective in the term. You can also ask if certain learning objectives for your course end up being repeated over the course of the term. For example, if students are working on a really large paper assignment and there's multiple drafts that are due of that paper assignment, it may be that you're working on repeating certain learning objectives to make sure that they're getting something through that repetition and through the practice of going through multiple drafts. So this is something you might want to note on your map if you have certain learning objectives that are being repeated throughout the term. Some additional questions are if you can scaffold assignments to help students develop skills over time. So it may be that you chunk an assignment over several weeks and have them do small parts of that assignment over time so that they can have practice, they can receive feedback, they can conduct their own self-assessments or peer assessments to learn through that process. You can also use your course map to ask if there's any learning objectives that are not measured in the course assessments. So as you go through the course, you might realize, I cover this, but I don't actually measure it in a particular assignment. And it would allow you to see if there's any gaps there. And then you can also look to see if there's a mix of your instructor-led teaching strategies and the student-led teaching strategies. And this one will also depend a lot on the level of your students. For example, if you have students who are in their third or their fourth year, you might have them doing more student-led work because they're more familiar with the college environment. They may have more autonomy and independence around their learning. They may have more skills about how to learn in those ways. But first year students may not have those same skills. So you might pull back and do more of the instructor-led work and save some of the guided inquiry for later in the term so that they can kind of get some practice for what to do in your course before they're going out and doing things on their own. And then a last couple of questions to think about is if you're providing students with opportunities for assessing if they're achieving the course's learning objectives, and maybe are you providing a range of different opportunities for them to do that? When you're asking students to provide evidence of their learning, what are the different ways that they can do that for you? And lastly, that question about social presence is that intentionally built in? Are you really creating a strong sense of how students can connect with you and can connect with each other throughout the course, just like we would always emphasize in a face-to-face learning environment as well? All right, so I think we can dive into some examples next. Don, you want to share what you came up with?
Absolutely. So there are two examples that you're going to see, and these are partial examples from my course. You're going to see the overall map where I've kind of started to transition between the weeks, as well as kind of a weekly planning one, which is a nice to-do list for what I'm going to do for that week and how I'm going to organize. And I prepared these for my general psychology class. General psychology is an introduction to psychological sciences, and it's basically the whole field a little bit at a time. So it requires me to get into a lot of different areas and to have students be challenged in a lot of different areas. And they're thinking about psychological sciences in terms of how people think, how people feel, and how they behave. So for the overall map, what you see here is just the first couple of weeks. So what I have here, and I don't know that you can see my cursor. So I'll say for week one, starting over here in the upper left corner, you can see the topic here is the course introduction as well as what is psychology. So in that first week, not only are they going to learn kind of what the course is going to be like and the elements of the course and course policies and those kind of things, but they're also going to get some of the foundations of what psychology as a discipline is and what it isn't, also its boundaries as a field. So my objectives are my students will interact with course elements in Canvas, and students will define psychology and its boundaries as a field. So right away now I've centered what I want my week to be on these objectives. And everything that I'm going to have in my course map is going to come back to those objectives. It's going to help me get to there. So for my direct instruction, my students will view a welcome video. So they'll meet me and they'll hear me talk about why I'm excited about the course. There's going to be some humanity and some authenticity in that. My students will also view a syllabus overview video. One of the things that I like to do is I like to go through my syllabus and all of the assignments that I give actually with them and kind of tell them things to kind of to focus on and recommendations for success and those kind of things. They'll also view a video modeling interaction with the Canvas page. So they'll actually see me going through the Canvas page, showing where things are, showing how to access the videos, how to upload assignments, those kind of things. And then we get into actual content. So those first three were kind of with that first objective, interacting with the course elements in Canvas. This next two, the students will view a video lecture on the definitions and boundaries of the field of psychology, and the highlights and questions with me are more geared toward the students who will define psychology and its boundaries as a field objective. So I'm now going to have that tutorial on that. And the highlights and cues with me, this is going to be a weekly kind of thing. You'll see this show up in my course map, each and every week. You'll see this for the first 2 weeks in our example here, where now they can meet with me synchronously. And we can talk through some of the highlights of what they learned, and also I can have some questions that they may have to kind of think about their confusions and help them learn. Now, it's not only direct instruction, that guided inquiry, the stuff that they're going to do on their own. First of all, students will use Canvas resources to complete a course scavenger hunt. So we'll kind of have this workshop or this worksheet, excuse me, we're like, find this element of the syllabus, find how many modules we have here, find the due date of this assignment. And they'll use those Canvas resources to find and answer the questions on the scavenger hunt. They'll then use their online textbook to answer homework questions on psychological schools of thought. And they'll participate in a discussion board about psychology being a science. One of the things that irks psychologists like myself is people saying that psychology is not a science, or if it is, it's a soft science. So we'll get at their ideas about that early on to transition into that next week of psychological research methods and showing how psychology uses the scientific method. But staying in week one, we then get to social presence, this ways for them to kind of interaction with me and interaction with each other. So the first way that I thought about having students do this in my first week of my class is to have them describe themselves using 6-word self-essays on the course discussion board. If you haven't used these before, 6-word essays I think are wonderful. It's basically you have to answer a question or describe something using only 6 words. And really it means you have to get at the essence, the most core, important parts of whatever it is you're talking about. So they're going to describe themselves, and they're going to put that up on the course discussion board. This is going to model them doing 6-word essays for things that we'll do later in the course, as well as introducing themselves to each other and creating a sense of community. It's also going to show me what they think is most important about themselves, which could maybe tailor the way that I talk about topics moving forward. The second way they're going to do social presence in that first week is to participate in a discussion board about psychology being a science. And I mentioned that already in the guided inquiry component. And they'll attend and contribute questions to the highlights and questions with Don's session. Now, as Katie mentioned, we got to make sure that our objectives are being assessed in some way. So my assessment evaluation plan for this first week in my course map is they're going to do a first week survey to assess motivations for taking the course and their preconceptions of psychology. So kind of getting a pre-test of what they think. They're going to do the course syllabus scavenger hunt that we talked about. And they're going to do that homework worksheet that I mentioned in the guided inquiry section to demonstrate their knowledge of schools of thought and psychology. And then these metacognitive reflection elements where the students are thinking about what they've learned and maybe what they've had questions with. For the first day survey, it'll include questions about their intrinsic and extrinsic motivation for taking the course. So they get to think about, why am I here? Why did I enroll in this course? Why am I taking this? How does this fit into my personal and professional goals? And that's important for all of my students in my classes to think about on that first day. The self-essays, they're going to ask, is going to ask the students to define themselves and their essential qualities. Now they've got to consider themselves. And a lot of psychology is kind of introspective. You think about your thoughts, you think about your feelings, you think about your motivations, you think about your personality, those characteristics. The self-essays are going to start them thinking like psychologists immediately. And then that science discussion board will allow students to consider the case for psychology being or not being a science. Okay. So that's my course map for week 1. Now week 1 transitions into week 2. So I won't go over into maybe quite as much detail, but I'll point out some highlights. So in week 2, we get into psychological research methods. And one of the things about psychological research methods is this is hard. There's a lot of information. There's a lot of stuff to learn. There's a lot of distinctions to make. And my objectives are focused around that. So students will describe the 3 main components of the scientific method. Students will list and define common terms used in psychological research methods. Students will discuss the distinguishing features of different psychological research designs like experimental versus correlational designs. And students will create psychological research hypotheses and propose methods of testing them. So we come into the direct instruction and we have some video tutorials. And these are broken down by modules of kind of the smallest kind of components of important content. So I have components of the scientific method as one video module. Another is the types of variables like independent versus dependent variable versus spurious variables and confounding variables. Then we talk about moving from hypotheses to theories to operational definitions. And then we have one talking about issues of causality and experimentation. This is where experimental designs, quasi-experimental designs, and correlational designs would be discussed. And then, as always, there's going to be the highlights and questions with Don. For guided inquiry, they're going to read a short journal article. And this will be something that I'll pick for their level. You know, they've been psychologists for all of a week. And we'll kind of share with them a short article where they can then go in and identify the research features, the independent variable, the dependent variable, the research design, and those kind of things. For social presence, we're going to start to model the same kind of things and continue this kind of things that we did early. So again, there's going to be a discussion board about scary questions. And the scary questions idea that I have in my classes are these are the questions you wouldn't want me to ask you on an exam or an assessment. And then I want to know why you don't want me to ask you those questions. So is it something that you're just not comfortable with? Is it complicated? Did I not do a good enough job providing foundation? Do you need more practice? This informs me not only about what they know, but what they don't know to help me teach. Here, because a huge part of the scientific method is peer review, they also have the opportunity to do some peer review. They provide feedback to each other on their research proposal worksheets. So this is going to be something that they can actually start to think about not only their own learning, but providing feedback to others in doing so. And then, as always, we have the highlights and cues session. We get to the assessment and evaluation. They have that research article worksheet that I mentioned where they have to find those design features. We have a research proposal worksheet to assess their ability to apply the content. So now we're getting at those higher levels of learning, kind of moving up those stages of Bloom's taxonomy, to assess their ability to apply the content to create psychological research questions that then inspire hypotheses, that inspire appropriate operational definitions. And then again, the metacognition of the week are these scary questions. After you've been through this, what are you least comfortable with me asking you about? So this is a sample of kind of that overall course map where I'm showing you a couple of weeks. And what it's helped me to do is to think about how everything maps back to my objectives and then how week 1 builds into week 2. And what I'm doing here is I'm setting up a rhythm to my class. I'm setting up things that I like. I'm setting up ways that my students are going to use to demonstrate in their learning. And I'm setting up points of contact for me both synchronously and asynchronously with my students. So this is kind of the overall view. And then for weekly planning, what we have here is this is just my week 1. So again, what I've done is I've taken the learning objectives and I put them over here into this left-hand column that the students will interact with the course elements in Canvas, as well as define psychology and its boundaries as a field. Over here now into these other kind of matrix of quadrants, in the upper left quadrant here, my online module content, and this helps me create that to-do list that I can work through, that plan as an instructor, knowing what I've got to produce each week. I have my welcome and syllabus video, my Canvas page video tutorial, my psychology as a field video, and then I'm going to have that synchronous element that highlights questions with Don. And when I look at the out of class activities, I now know that there's going to be the course scavenger hunt that week, the schools of thought homework questions, the discussion board about psychology being a science that I'm going to create for my students. My synchronous assessments that week are to be informal learning checks with highlights and cues with me. So I'm going to use the chat feature as well as the ability for them to actually talk if they're comfortable, where I can see what it is they're learning. And because that's synchronous, I can probe them with questions, I can ask follow-ups and do those kind of things. The asynchronous assessments that they're going to do on their own in post are the first day survey, the course syllabus scavenger hunt, and the schools of thought homework questions. So right away, I have this wonderful idea of how everything is going to interconnect, how everything is going to be given out by me and given back by them, and how everything relates back to my learning objectives. And then down in the notes, and me thinking about this and kind of trying to anticipate what I'm doing. So the big question students often have in this section, having taught this course before, is psychology really a science? And how do these schools of thought really differ? And those are hard questions. So what I can do, and I have a note to myself, is get ahead of these questions. Use the chat and the polling features during the highlights and questions with me to check the learning and then resolve their confusion. I think any time where I can enter a week of content and know where the difficulty has been and proactively try to get around that difficulty, provide more clarity before confusion starts, it helps me to be a better teacher. So right here, I have something that's providing me that psychological comfort and safety. I know what's going to happen this week. And when I get those videos done and posted them, all right, I'm done with that part of the matrix. And then I move to the next part of the matrix. So I love the plan that this provides for me. And like I said, this is not busy work. This is something that's helpful for me. And a recommendation that I would make about course mapping is do these in ways that are going to be helpful for you. Do these in ways that are going to make your teaching more effective and more excellent. Because if it's not going to help you to do that, then it's just an exercise. And I would rather this was something that actually compelled us to be excellent teachers.
Awesome. Okay. Thanks, Don. Those are great examples. We had some questions coming in through the chat that we fielded some of them by just responses in the chat. But this is the time that we have for the group to ask any questions that you might have about course mapping or maybe other things that have come up for you so far in the Online Course Design Institute. And also there is a kind of task in there about building your list of things to create, whether that's videos or assignments or other things you might want to do. And as you can see from Don's example, this is a really great way to have a sense of what it is you're supposed to be planning for or creating for the course in any given week. So Laura, were there any questions that came in that we haven't had a chance to address yet? Or if other folks want to add questions to the chat or unmute, they're welcome to do that too.
I don't think so. Certainly, if any of you would like to follow up with your questions, if you didn't feel they were fully answered, please do. And yeah, please feel free to unmute your microphones now or continue to type into the chat. It looks like Michi just added another one.
All right, so this looks like, how do you motivate students to participate in synchronous activities, discussion forums, etc.? Sometimes you get mixed success with these. Now, discussion forums can often be asynchronous activities. Is that what you mean? I want to clarify that.
I'm just going to unmute myself. It's going to be easier, probably.
Yeah, go ahead.
I struggled with two things this semester, and that is, getting students to, zoom in on. I have something similar as Dawn in terms of the highlights and questions, but I get only a small fraction of students participating in that. And I've tried to use the discussion forums asynchronously for students to engage with each other and with me, and the participation is just way lower than what I would have hoped.
So I think there's a couple ways you can kind of come at this. One way is to kind of treat this sort of like office hours, and if people have questions, they come, and if they don't, they don't. And then not worry about it in that way. If you want students there, you may want to kind of add a sign-in feature to your chat function and then give a point or two for them kind of coming in and signing in each week. Another way to do it to kind of get around the way that students may not be able to synchronously attend is to record that Zoom session and then post it and have students write a reflection after. So I think there's some ways that you can kind of get them there. But one of the things that I'm not a huge fan of is to have people just showing up to show up. I'd rather them show up with a reason. I'd rather them show up with intention. So if I'm going to offer highlights. And like I said, in mine, I'm going to, and kind of, these are the big things that I want you to take forward. I'm imagining that there's going to be value in that above and beyond the other kind of things that I've done. And then the ability for them to follow up on those highlights is going to be helpful. But I'm anticipating, I haven't done this yet. So I don't know exactly what my participation is going to be like. My best kind of, I guess, analog to this so far is I have Zoom office hours right now in the course that went, emergency remote. And I think there have only been 2 days that I haven't had students show up for Zoom office hours. Now, it might be 1 or 2 students. I think the most I've had is 6, but they're showing up. And they're showing up with real questions, and that's helpful to me. And it makes me feel like they're kind of taking some proactive ownership of their education, which is something that I always promote in my classes. So I think you got to think about why you're having the synchronous connection. And then if it's important that they're there, why is it important that they're there? And make it valuable. Now, there's 2 ways to make it valuable. You can make it valuable for their learning. You can make it valuable for points. One of those is intrinsic. I think the other is extrinsic. And that's just a decision you'll have to make about your course, I think.
Yeah, that's great advice. Actually, one thing that I did that may have, reduced my direct participation, at least in the Zoom meetings, is I did exactly what you said. I recorded kind of my virtual office hours, and I also gave students an opportunity to submit questions offline before the meeting that I would address, so that people that couldn't attend, they could ask questions, and they could also then view the responses. And that may have been part of the reason why, like you, I would get between 2 and 8 students, I think, is what I've had this semester. But thanks for your thoughts. I appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we're all figuring this out. So that's a great question.
Yeah.
I think I'll add just a little bit. One of the things that I would emphasize that Don said is the intentionality of it. We do find when we have sort of those general Q&A sessions that if a student thinks they don't have a question, they think, well, I shouldn't go, right? That I'm just, there's nothing for me to learn or something like that. So being very intentional, what you said about having them post questions ahead of time, that's great. Having them all say, you need to come up with a question and bring it to this session so that we can compare and see if everybody's on, the same track, or if there are some misunderstandings, those kinds of things. So, that can be done synchronously or asynchronously, but making sure that those types of discussions or meetings, the students understand why it's important that they be there.
I would also add one more thing, and that is for students who are engaging in some of these activities for the first time, they may not know their value. Like they may not know the value until they experience it. So even doing something in your syllabus where you say, you have to come to at least 3 of these throughout the term. You get to pick when you come, but for like online office hours, for example, I'd like you to show up at least 3 times, and that's part of your attendance grade or participation grade, is that you show up and you try it. So that can be another way to think about it. And also the other way to think about this too is in some of these synchronous events, if you have students take the lead on, for example, generating discussion questions, or they have to like kick off the discussion with their peers, sometimes their peers will show up for their peers. They may not show up for you, but if they know that their peers are counting on them to be there, they may show up for that. They may want to be supportive. So there's a few other ways, I think, to kind of encourage them to show up, to try and experiment with something, but also to engage that social presence a little bit more so that they're really showing up in support of their classmates.
Yeah, those are great points. One of the things I really like, Dawn, is your scary questions. That's a really fantastic ideas, and I imagine if you frame, kind of your highlights around student scary questions explicitly, that might be also enticing for them to participate.
Yeah,
Make it
thank
not
you for that
scary
feedback.
anymore.
I've started doing them this semester. I have my students not take exams, but I have them write their own exams and take their own exams. And one option, they can have one question that's a scary question, or I think I have them as a fair and unanswerable question, I think is what I'm calling them now, but I like scary better moving forward. And it really gets to kind of the crux of what they didn't learn and what they didn't know. And what I've been doing in my office hours is answering those scary questions. So that
Yeah.
was really where some of this inspiration came from. But I think that, as a teacher, sometimes I'll come out of a class and say, and this is the face-to-face even, and say, wow, I don't know that I'd be prepared to answer that question if I were to ask myself that question based on what I said. So I think it provides them an opportunity for being reinforced for their feedback. Right? They give us feedback, we provide them more learning, and it creates some ownership for them and some investment. So thank you for appreciating that.
Okay, I see another question here about concept mapping as it relates to course mapping. And I think you could definitely do concept mapping as a way to think about kind of brainstorming your course mapping. I often think about concept mapping as trying to connect different topics to each other and show the relationships between those topics. So it's a great assignment for students, especially a culminating assignment to help them synthesize how different theories related to each other, or how one theorist impacted another theorist in a particular way, or how different topics kind of relate to each other. I would imagine that as the expert in your course, you may already know those things. You may already have a sense of some of those relationships and kind of how you want things to be organized. But concept mapping can always be kind of a creative way to help you think about, am I presenting this information in the best way that I could? Because any course has multiple ways that it can be ordered in terms of the content and still be effective. We could look at it in some courses as being chronological. In other courses, we might choose certain topics that need to be introduced before other topics. I've seen a lot of really creative course designs where people map them in a lot of different ways. So for you, the concept mapping might be kind of a creative activity to be thinking about, what are the range of different possibilities here in terms of how I could present the information. Don, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I would say that the concept map for me helps figure out those transitions in the ordering. So I don't necessarily have my students do a concept map early on, but I know what that concept map would look like. And then I do something, as Katie has said, more as a culmination at the end of my class. But I think that the course mapping and the concept mapping for me, it's all about connections and relationships and creating the best story that I'm going to tell over that semester. So I think they're related, but they're not exactly the same thing in my opinion.
Other questions from folks? Feel free to unmute or add something into the chat.
It is Mickey again. I'm sorry that I'm bombarding you with questions. But what are your thoughts on consistency of structure from week to week? I'm finding myself, I feel like structure is extremely important, because once students get it, they're a lot less likely to, miss assignments, to get confused. So I've gotten into habits over the years of kind of having a very similar structure from week to week, in terms of, they have a reading quiz every week, they have, a math assignment every week, and so on. But some of the feedback I get is that it gets monotonous. And so where do you guys stand on these kind of, changing it up versus keeping it consistent?
I can start with that. I think that I refer to it as a rhythm. And my classes have a rhythm. This is going to happen on Monday. This is going to happen on Wednesday. This is going to be due at this time. I don't move around my due dates. Typically right now, my due dates are always, midnight on Monday from the previous week. And then new information gets posted on Monday morning. And there'll be an assignment each week. And I think where things get switched up is what the assignment is. So on Monday, you'll get the assignment for the following Monday at midnight, but it'll be different each week. It might be the same number of points. It might be about the same structure, but you're doing different things in the assignment. So I think having a routine, having a rhythm is not a bad thing at all. I think having your students do exactly the same thing week to week in terms of how they complete that assignment, that reflection, that whatever, that could potentially get monotonous. So I think thinking about where you can switch it up, because I can't do the exact same thing each week to satisfy my differing learning outcomes week to week. So think about the best way to do that. That becomes the thing you switch up.
I would agree with
Thank you.
Don. I think that there's a baseline of structure that especially right now, I think students really appreciate. There's a lot going on that's unknown. There's a lot of things that are in flux. So to have something that feels like a level of consistency and order is useful. And that allows them to plan. It allows them to know when things are due and what amount of time they might need to spend on that. And I think for online students in general, when we think about our students in Global Campus, some of them are working, they have families, like they're needing that structure so that they can plan into their daily lives. And our traditional age students are not that different. They've got a lot of things going on too. So I think that that structure is really important. But I would agree with Dawn that there are ways to mix it up, like asking different kinds of questions. And I would also say, and I was just talking with a faculty member about this yesterday, they were feeling very overwhelmed and they were looking at what they had planned for the week and didn't feel like they could do it. Like they were kind of at an emotional kind of stopping point just in their own kind of personal life, and it was really starting to affect their teaching. And we talked about, like, well, how could you switch this up? So instead of doing the thing that you normally would have done that feels really hard for you right now, is there another thing that you can kind of give to your students that would give you a little bit of a break from, and for the case of this faculty member, that it was grading involved with it and they just didn't feel like they could keep up. They needed a kind of a break from the original plan that they'd created for themselves. So the nice thing about a course map is you can kind of take the pieces from that week and say, can these be redistributed? Can I do a different kind of assessment check with my students that wouldn't be so onerous on me? Can we just give us all a break from kind of what the original plan was, and just have a moment to do like a synthesis week where we look at all the things that came before instead of introducing new information? This is something that I always really enjoyed putting into my classes, was synthesis weeks where we didn't do anything new. We just played with what we'd already learned and figured out how all of it related to each other. So I think that the structure is helpful, but I want to give that caveat that if you're in a situation where you're like, I'm kind of at my breaking point and I just don't feel like I can do what I had planned, you have the flexibility to potentially make some changes in there, even if it means breaking the structure, that you had created for the course. So I think there's a flexibility that we need to have with ourselves in addition to the flexibility that we need to have with our students. And that's going to be very personal for all of us in terms of what that could look like in the classroom.
Awesome. Thank you both so much. This was super helpful.
I think Katie makes a great point about being flexible with ourselves too. Just allowing your students and yourselves a break, even if it's a regular semester. Maybe you just need to pivot, and it's okay to do that. And if you have an idea of something that would take you out of that normal structure that you think would be great sort of mid-semester or 3 times a semester or something like that, just prepping the students that, okay, this is our routine that we've built, but this is going to be fun and different, right? And it's coming up next week. Just giving them that heads up that something's going to be a little bit different to break the rhythm is good too.
Any other questions? Yeah, that would be helpful for us to talk about, or other topics. Dawn is filled with good ideas. This is a really great opportunity to just poke at him and see what he has to say about different topics. All right, I'm wondering if we can spend just a quick moment, Laura, showing people where in the Online Course Design Institute the templates are for this exercise that we did. It is called course mapping, so it should be relatively easy to find in week 2, but we had a couple of questions about if we had templates and where they are.
Okay.
So let's just do a quick letting people know where that's located within the course map. And I did also drop earlier a link. Someone had asked about a digital scavenger hunt, and I just did a quick Google search for digital scavenger hunt Canvas and came up with an example. So I think that this is one of those things that a lot of people have tried before. If you're looking for different possibilities there, look around, see what the different options are.
Okay.
All right, so in week 2, yeah, go ahead.
And so we have the draft of your course map and the live event here. And so in this page here with course mapping, you should have links to all of the resources. It's called the Course Skeleton Table and the weekly planning worksheet. So they're right there and you should be able to download them and make them work for you.
We also have an optional assignment where we would love for you to submit your map and get feedback if that's helpful. And I would also add that if you're open to sharing your example of your course map with others, I think we all saw how helpful it was to see Dawn's example today. So if you're filling this out anyway and you'd be willing to share it with this group's Online Course Design Institute members or other Online Course Design Institute members in the future, let us know, because we would love to be able to post some examples for people to give them a sense of what this can look like. And Dawn, if you're willing, we'll maybe post some of the examples you showed today as well so that people can refer back to it if they want to see what that looks like.
Sure.
All right. Thank you all so much for attending. This recording will be available so you can go back and take a look at it and encourage others to take a look at it. Hopefully you found this valuable as kind of going over the course mapping process. And we look forward to reviewing your course maps if you'd like feedback. So thank you all so much for joining us today, and we will see you online.